So in chapter 11, we talked about a couple concepts, production and cost. And remember, the difference between the short run and long run production functions is that in the short run, one of your inputs is fixed. So look at the table below. You see that labor doesn't change? So this is our fixed input. Making capital our variable input to produce some quantity Q. And what's interesting is that we can come up with, depending on what's typically in our models here, we're going to talk about labor and capital as our inputs. And so some combination of the two gives you some production Q for quantity. I'm going to use K for capital because I usually like to save C for cost. And so what we can do is get our marginal production of capital. And what does that mean? So marginal production of capital looks at the change in quantity over the change in capital. So you can take Q2 minus Q1 and compare it to K2 minus K1. Now, for example, or just another thing to consider, say labor was variable and capital was fixed, you can come up with your MPL, marginal production of labor. And the only difference is taking the change in quantity over the change in labor. And so how would you interpret these? Well, MPK says that if you have a 1% increase in capital, then you're going to have some change in your production. And what MPL says is if you have a 1% change or increase in labor, you'll have some change to your production. So let's take a moment and apply some numbers. So we can come up with our change in capital, our change in quantity. So the change in capital is just taking your new minus old. You notice that really we're just having a 1 unit increase. Our change in quantity is 15, 10, 7, and 3. So then there's no comparison on the first row. So you'll take your 15, divide by 1 to get 15. Next is 10 over 1, which is 10. And so forth. So what's happening here? Well, the change in production is positive, but it's increasing at a decreasing rate. So let's see what that means. If I go from 0 units of capital to 1 unit of capital, I can produce 15 more units. Now, if I go from 1 unit to 2 units of capital, I'm only going to produce 10 more units of product. And so that's how you want to read these things. Just to mention, in the long run, production has both capital as variable and labor as variable. So we mostly will not be working with this long-run production function, maybe in an intermediate course or a more advanced course. But for right now, we are just going to focus on the short-run production. Okay? So what that looks like graphically is that here's, capital and quantity. And you notice that things are increasing as capital increases. So you go from 0 to 0, 1 to 15, 25. So it looks something like this. Right? So this is your production function. And then what's going to happen is that these things are decreasing. So you first get some really large benefit, and then it decreases as you keep producing with more units of capital. And so this is the marginal production of capital. But we typically don't draw these functions like this. So let me just zoom out a little bit. We're going to let this be the capital. Quantity. Let this be capital. And so 0, let's do 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, and 40. And then 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay. So 0, 0, 1, comma 15, 2, comma 25, 3, comma 32, and 4, comma 35. Let's see if I can draw this. So we usually draw our production functions like this. Then to get your marginal curve, it'll tell a very similar story where we know these are 2 points. So it's going to look something like this. And so the story is that as you increase in capital, you're increasing in quantity produced, but at a slower rate. So production increases at a decreasing rate. Okay. Now for cost, well, I think I forgot to add something here. Well, we can do some insinuating. So remember in this case that now here capital is fixed, labor is variable, and these two will produce some level of quantity. And so here I give you fixed cost and variable cost. And the two of these together give you total cost, right? So total cost is fixed cost plus variable cost. Let's see if that's true. 500 plus 0 gives you 500. 500 plus 200 gives you 700s. So far, so good. 5 plus 4, 9. So it's holding up. Now, what I'm interested in is what is our average fixed cost, our average variable cost, and our average total cost. Well, average total cost takes your total cost at some level of quantity, divide by that quantity. Average variable cost takes your variable cost at some given level of quantity, divided by that quantity. And you take, for average fixed cost at some given level, divided by that level. And you can see that average fixed cost plus average variable cost adds up to average total cost. Okay. And then marginal cost is the change in total cost over the change in quantity. So TC2 minus TC1 over Q2 minus Q1. So it looks like you take this number here and multiply by 20 to get the variable cost. And then to get the fixed cost, you take your fixed input and multiply by 50. So this will give you that. This gives you this. Our change in quantity. So 15, 13, 10, 6, 4. This is the change in quantity. Okay. So we'll do a couple of examples of each, and then on your own, fill in the rest of the table. So average fixed cost. Well, here you won't have any averages at all because you can't divide by 0. So here for average fixed cost, take 500 and divide by 15. Again, take 500 and divide by 28. 500 divide by 38. 500 divide by 44. And 500 divide by 48. And that's how you get your average fixed cost. For average variable cost, it'll be 200 divided by 15, 200 divided by 28, not 200, I'm sorry. This is 400 divided by 28. 600 divided by 38. 800 divided by 44. And 1,000 divided by 48. Okay? And then add these two together and you get your total and your average total cost, as I showed from down here. How do I get the marginal cost? Well, for this one here, let's see how I got that 13. Well, I'm going to take the change in quantity divided by the change in cost. So the 13.3 was taking 200, because that's the change in total cost, divided by 15. Okay. So that wraps up our conversation on cost functions. Just something I want to point out because of the nature of these things. Here's quantity. Here's dollars per something. And so see total cost is increasing as quantity increases. And so maybe it looks something like this. So TC. Fixed cost is at the same level. So here's what fixed cost looks like. And then variable cost increases. And so you take the two and you add them together to get that total cost. Okay. Then there's that little snippet. Notice that you get a similar thing happening with average total cost and average variable cost. So then you get some behavior that looks like this. And then marginal cost maybe it looks something like this. Okay. So finally, let's talk about a perfectly competitive industry. And what we're going to do is find the following functions: the variable costs, the fixed costs, average variable costs, and average total costs for each firm. Determine what the shutdown price is and what is the break-even price. Okay. So we'll do that in just one moment.